Hi, so we continue with Unit 3. We are now in Session 2. My name is Elias. In this video, I want us to continue with the Heckscher all-in theory and then look at the factor intensity and the factor abundance and then illustrate the Heckscher all-in model. Let's begin with the factor intensity model. So we have looked at factor intensity in terms of just description, and then we assumed commodity X is labor intensive while commodity Y is capital intensive. But we have not described or defined what factor intensity is all about. So here in the world of two commodities, X and Y, and two factors, labor and capital, we say that commodity Y is capital intensive if the capital labor ratio used in the production of Y is greater than the capital labor ratio used in the production of commodity X. If we reverse this, we would say that still in the two commodity nation and two factor nations, we would say that commodity Y is capital intensive if the labor, you find in other books written in terms of labor first and then capital, so is capital intensive if the labor capital ratio used in the production of commodity Y is smaller than or is less than the labor capital ratio used in the production of commodity X. So because now here we want just to specify and maybe stick to capital being the first input, then when the capital labor ratio is high in the production of a given commodity compared to the other, then such a commodity is said to be intensive in capital. For example, so before maybe I take you to an example, you should note that we are not considering the actual amounts of capital used, but the ratio, the capital labor ratio. Commodity X may have more capital and maybe more labor compared to commodity Y, but if the capital labor ratio is high in the production of commodity Y compared to the ratio in the production of commodity X, then Y is said to be capital intensive. For example, if we have we are considering maybe using 2 units of capital, so let's call it 2K, and 2 units of labor, 2L, in the production of commodity Y. So we have commodity Y here. It means that the capital labor ratio will be 2 over 2, which will simply be equal to 1. And that is in the production of commodity Y. And if in the production of commodity X, we are considering to use 1 unit of capital and 4 units of labor, then it means that the capital labor ratio will be 1 over 4, and this will simply be a quarter the way it is. This means that you will notice that the capital labor ratio is high in the production of commodity Y compared to the production of commodity X, because 1 is greater than 1 over 4. This means that commodity Y is capital intensive while commodity X is labor intensive. So we will use the theory and the assumption we made when we were looking at comparative advantage, that since commodity Y is capital intensive, then commodity X should be labor intensive. Let's look at the graphical illustration of this and see what we get out of it. So consider nation 1, where we have the ray drawn from the origin, and then we measure the slope. So we notice that the slope along this line will be equal to 1, meaning the capital labor ratio will be equal to 1. So if you divide 4 units of capital at this point and 4 units of labor at this point, you will get a 1, meaning, and we are measuring this in the production of commodity Y in nation 1. And if we go to the production of commodity X, we see that the capital labor ratio along this ray, any point that you will pick, you will get the capital labor ratio of 1 over 4. Meaning that commodity Y in nation 1 is capital intensive, while commodity X in nation 1 is labor intensive. If we go to nation 2, now we see that for nation 2, this light blue line is measuring the the intensity of commodity Y. So along this ray, any point that you will pick will give you a point, the capital labor ratio of 4. So if you pick this dot here, capital 4, labor 1, if you divide 4 divided by 1, you will get 4. If you pick this point here, capital 8, labor 2, if you divide 8 divided by 2, you will get 4, meaning the capital labor ratio in the production of Y is 4 in nation 2. While this line here is showing the capital labor ratio in the production of commodity X, but still in nation 2. So we see that along this ray drawn from the origin, if you measure the slope, any point that you pick along the ray will give you the slope of 1. So 2 units of capital divided by 2 units of labor will give you 1, and 4 units of capital divided by 4 units of labor will give you 1, meaning the capital labor ratio in the production of commodity X in nation 2 is equal to 1. And if you compare the capital labor ratio that you have here in the production of Y of 4 and the one you see in the production of X of 1, you will see that the capital labor ratio in nation 2 for the production of Y is greater than that used in the production of commodity X. And as such, we see that in nation 2, Y is capital intensive while X is labor intensive. And clearly we see then we can make a general conclusion that commodity Y is capital intensive in both nations, because even in nation 1, commodity Y had a higher capital labor ratio compared to commodity X. Meaning commodity Y is capital intensive in both nations and commodity X is labor intensive in both nations. And this is in proof of the assumption that we made. Okay, so from there, nation 2 uses a higher capital labor ratio than 1 in the production of both commodities because the relative price of capital is lower in nation 2. So you will see that where we are looking at nation 1 in general, where nation 1 has a higher capital labor ratio in the production of both commodities, we are looking at the prices of the factors of production. So let's go back to our previous graph. So if you look at nation 2, so look at the production of commodity Y. The capital labor ratio here is high, 4 compared to 1. And if you look at the production of commodity X, the capital labor ratio here again is high, 1 compared to 1 over 4. So nation 2 then has a higher capital labor ratio in the production of both commodities compared to nation 1, and this is because the relative factor price is lower in nation 2. In other words, the relative price, that's the price of capital and labor, is cheaper in nation 2 compared to what we see in nation 1. Okay, so with that then, if the factor price ratios declined, producers would substitute capital for labor in the production of both commodities to minimize their cost of production. So if we are seeing this part declining, and the only way this part will decline is, number one, if we reduce the numerator, keeping the denominator constant, that is, if we increase the interest rate, keeping the numerator constant. And because the interest rate increases, it means capital will become more attractive and there will be a high supply of capital, meaning then capital will be substituted for labor. The other way is to reduce the denominator. Now, if the denominator is reduced, meaning wage is being reduced, labor supply will be less attractive and therefore more capital will be substituted for labor. So if the RW, or the rental price of capital to wage ratio, declined, then producers definitely would substitute capital for labor in production of both commodities, and this will help them minimize the cost of production. As a result, it will force the capital labor ratio to rise in the production of both commodities. Because if this part is declining, and we are seeing that the only way this part would decline is that if this part here, the R, is also declining. As a result, we would see that the capital labor ratio will start rising for both commodities. Let's turn our focus to factor abundance. So factor abundance can be defined in two forms. So we look at first the form of the physical units of factors used in the production process, and then we also define factor abundance in terms of the relative factor prices of the units used in the production process. Let's take the first definition of the physical units. Nation 2 is said to be capital abundant if the ratio of the total amount of capital to the total amount of labor available in Nation 2 is greater than that in Nation 1. So recall here, we are not again looking at just the actual amount of capital, the total, and the total amount of labor, but we are looking at the ratio of the total amount of capital to the total amount of labor. So in our previous case, where we saw a graph where Nation 2 had a higher capital labor ratio both in the production of X and Y compared to Nation 1, Nation 2 then is said to be capital abundant. Okay, so Nation 2 can have less capital than Nation 1 and still be the capital abundant nation as long as the ratio of the total units of capital to the total units of labor in Nation 2 exceed that in Nation 1. So we can have say 4 units of total capital and 2 units of labor in Nation 2. Okay, so let's have this Nation 2. So that this gives us a ratio of 2. And then we can have in Nation 2, we can have let's say 12 against the maybe 24. Let's make this example. 24 units of labor where we now get 1/2, half. So we see that Nation 1 has more capital and more labor, but a smaller capital labor ratio. Whereas Nation 2 has fewer units of capital and fewer units of labor, but a higher capital labor ratio, meaning Nation 2 is capital abundant, while Nation 1 will be labor abundant. Okay, so we can also define factor abundance in terms of relative factor prices. So Nation 2 is capital abundant if the ratio of the rental price of capital to the rental price of labor is lower in Nation 2 than in Nation 1. In other words, what we are saying is that Nation 2 is capital abundant if the rental price of capital, which is R, is, the ratio of R to W is lower in Nation 2 compared to Nation 1. That means the relative factor prices are cheaper in Nation 2, and therefore the factors of production are cheaper to obtain. Then it means that if this ratio is lower, then Nation 2 is capital abundant. And if this ratio is higher compared to Nation 1, then the converse will be true. Okay, so from this, then we note that it is not the absolute level of R that determines whether or not a nation is the capital abundant nation. But recall, we are looking at the ratio of the rental price of capital to the price of labor brought into the production process. So we need to take this, to consider this carefully and then be able to define what happens. Let's look at the graphical illustration of factor abundance or factor intensity. So from this graph, we see that Nation 1's production frontier has been defined to be this one here, and then Nation 2's production frontier is defined to be this one. Now you will notice that nation 1's frontier is flat and then bulging down along the, bulging down and moving along the x-axis, while nation 2's frontier is bulging up and moving along the y-axis, to show that nation 1 is labor abundant, and therefore labor and commodity X is the labor intensive commodity. Therefore nation 1 has a comparative advantage in the production of commodity X. In terms of nation 2, its production frontier moves along the y-axis to show that nation 2 is capital abundant. And because commodity Y is capital intensive, then nation 2 has a comparative advantage in the production of commodity Y. And if this be the case, it means that the two nations then can each specialize, though partially, in the production of the commodity of its comparative advantage and have an advantage to exchange with the other nation for the commodity of its comparative disadvantage. So let's look at the illustration of the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem using our previous graph. So if we bring in this graph here, where we are assuming, recall, that this graph is for nation 1 and this one here is for nation 2. Nation 1 is in autarky at point A, while nation 2 is in autarky at point A prime. You will notice that both nations are on the same indifference curve, which shows that then they have equal test. So the tests are equal, so what is changing is different, is just the capacities in their production process due to their factor intensities. Now, if you measure the slope at point A, you will notice that the slope here will be smaller than the slope measured along this indifference curve, which means then that nation 1, which is at point A, has a comparative advantage in the production of commodity X, while nation 2 has a comparative advantage in the production of commodity Y. And if you look at the slopes, you will see that this PA here, which is the domestic relative commodity price, is greater than the one for nation 1. So this part at this point here, the slope here is greater than the slope here. So this should be noted. So with trade then, nation 1 can move and produce at a different level. So let's bring in the second graph where we can show this. So if trade is allowed and nations then are to move away from their point of, from their autarky points, nation 1 then will specialize in the production of commodity X and move to point B, while nation 2 will specialize in the production of commodity Y and move to point B prime. And through trade, the two nations can exchange commodities. So nation 1 then will export this amount of X and import this amount of Y, while nation 2 will export this amount of Y and import this amount of X, and both nations will consume at point E, which is equal to E prime. And this is the international consumption level, and you should note that the trading triangle, this one here, is equal to this trading triangle here, because the export of one nation equals the import of the other nation. Okay, so it should be noted that the Heckscher-Ohlin model does not require that tests, distribution of income, and technology be exactly the same in the two nations, in the two nations for these results to hold. But what will be required is only that they be broadly similar and not necessarily equal. This is the reason why the assumption of equal test, distribution of income, and technology do simplify this model so that we avoid any ambiguities that may arise in this presentation or in this model. Okay, so now let's turn our focus to factor price equalization theorem, which is the second part of the Heckscher-Ohlin model. So here, the factor price equalization theorem only holds when the Heckscher-Ohlin HO theory holds. Okay, So it is also called the Heckscher-Ohlin-Samuelson theorem, or simply the Horst theorem. This is because the one who proved this model is Paul Samuelson. So Paul Samuelson then joins in the model, and the whole model gets to be called the Horst theorem, or Heckscher-Ohlin and Samuelson theorem. Okay, so now this theorem then postulates that international trade will bring about equalization in the relative and absolute returns to homogeneous factors across nations. Now, what this means is that the factor prices will be equalized because international trade will form basis, or rather will be a substitute for international mobility of factors. So as opposed to transporting labor to another nation, because the nations will specialize in producing commodities which are abundant, which are intensive in a given factor, then trading between two nations or amongst nations will allow for prices of the factor inputs to be equalized. As such, we say international trade is a substitute for international mobility of factors. Now, this means that international trade will cause the wage of homogeneous labor to be the same in all trading nations. Because if both nations are producing both commodities and the labor is very expensive, say in Zambia, as compared to, say, Malawi, it means that most people in Malawi would want to come and work in Zambia. But because of international trade and nations specializing in producing commodities where they are efficient, the labor prices will be going up and the two will be equalized. As such, we need to note also that international trade will cause the homogeneous capital, price of capital, to be the same in all trading nations. And for this to be true, all Heckscher-Ohlin assumptions, which are 11, must hold. Okay, now since nation 1 is labor abundant and has a comparative advantage in the production of commodity X, it means that labor is cheaper in nation 1 than in nation 2. Because nation 1 has a lot of labor, and therefore because it's abundant, wherever we have resources that are too much, the price or the value of those resources get to reduce. And from this, then, international trade will cause the wage to rise in nation 1, but to fall in nation 2. This is because there will be pressure moving from the movement of factors between the nations that are involved in international trade. So in short, we say that international trade will cause the price of labor to increase in nation 1 and reduce in nation 2. Okay, so these changes will continue until the labor prices are equal in the trading nations. If there is any gap, it means that there will be more basis and more need why nations should export more commodities to ensure that the prices are equalized. Thus, international trade tends to reduce the pre-trade difference in interest rate as well as in wage between the two trading nations and ensure that there is equalization. And now, as long as the relative factor prices differ, relative commodity prices will differ and the trade will continue to expand. So as long as there is still a gap, it means nations will continue trading until one nation, also the other nation, has enough of the goods brought from the other nation for the two prices to equalize. And therefore, the expansion of trade thus reduces the differences in factor prices between the two nations. Now, let's look at the relative factor price equalization. So let's consider this graph here, where we are seeing that nation 1 is at point A in autarky, while nation 2 is at A prime in autarky. And we notice that on the vertical axis, we are measuring the relative factor prices, while on the horizontal axis, we are measuring, the relative commodity prices on vertical axis, while on the horizontal axis, we are measuring the relative factor prices. Now, at point A, we see that in nation 1, the relative commodity price is lower and the relative factor price is lower, while in nation 2, the relative factor price is higher and the relative commodity price is higher. As such, the two nations will continue trading and each specializing in the commodity of its comparative advantage, and by exchanging, the relative factor prices and therefore commodity prices will be, for nation 2, which is high, will be gravitating downwards towards point B, and where in nation 1, where it's lower, the relative factor price as well as the relative commodity price will be rising until the two are equalized at point B prime. So now when the nations are at point B prime, it means that then nations have acquired lots and they are able to trade freely, and then the comparative advantage will end at that point. Okay, so we should note that trade acts as a substitute for international mobility of factors of production in effect and in its effect on factor prices. Thank you very much for watching. If you have questions, please send an email to muawelias@gmail.com. I will see you in session 3.